Great. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the NSERC grant writing workshop. So my name is Laurent Kreplak. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Science. And before I give you a very short presentation, I just want to let the panel introduce themselves. So we have representatives to almost most of the NSERC Discovery grant panels. So maybe Alison?
Sure. So I'm Alison Thompson. I'm the group chair of the Chemistry Evaluation group. So I've actively evaluated 4 times and have been a group chair once.
My name is Evangelos Milios from the Faculty of Computer Science. I was 3 years on the evaluation group, computer science evaluation group, and also 3 years as group chair, and that was 4 or 5 years ago.
I'm Kimberly Hall. I'm in the Department of Physics, and I have been on the Physics Evaluation Group for 2 years. I just agreed to bump up to the next level for the next year.
I'm Donald Mitchell from Psychology and Neuroscience, and I've just finished 3 years on the panel 1502, which I have no idea what the real name of that is, but I can remember the numbers.
I'm Joanna Fleming. I was on the Math and Stats Evaluation Group for 3 years. I just completed chairing that group, so I'm done.
I'm Craig Lake from Civil Engineering. I was on 1509 for 3 years, 1 year as a section chair, and I wrote my Discovery grant last year. It was successful.
So basically what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the structure of the evaluation process for both the Discovery and RTI grants. And we'll talk a little bit about EDI as well at the end. And then you're welcome to ask questions, which is the main part of this workshop. So let me get started briefly with a typical Discovery grant evaluation process. So typically in each evaluation group, you have 5 members are going to be reviewing your proposal. 2 are so-called internal reviewers, and you have 3 readers. And you also have 2 to 3 referee reports depending on availability. Then you have to realize that each member is going to be reading between 20 and 30 applications as internal reviewer, and around 30 to 40 as a reader. And of course, the ratings are excellence of researcher, merit of proposal, and HQP training. So in terms of aspects that are rated, for the rating, basically you get the median of the 5 members, and you have these 6 choices that I think you're all familiar with, and I recommend you have a look at what they mean for each category: exceptional, outstanding, very strong, strong, moderate, and insufficient. And in terms of deliberation, it's actually very fast. You have 15 minutes per application. So you have basically the first internal reviewer presents the ratings. Then you have, with some rationale, then you have the second internal reviewer that's adding on top of that summary and own ratings, and then each reader comments and rates. Then you have a discussion following, and a secret electronic vote for each rating provides a median. And the only time where you would get feedback is if you get a moderate or insufficient outcome in some of the rating, in some of the categories. Then the committee must provide a consensus-focused comment. Now, in terms of previous grant, there's no memory effect in principle. So, for example, the grant amount is not discussed. The previous grant amount is not discussed. And of course, you're going to need, your proposal is read mostly by non-experts. So you need clarity and accessibility for your proposal. And often the summary for public release is used to form the first opinion. Again, in principle, the committee is not supposed to go on the internet or search for information. Everything that they use is what you give them. The only time where web search is allowed is if they want to check validity. And that, my understanding is that that's fairly rare. And referee reports are, of course, very important for the readers, but you have to understand that the quality varies. So you don't, the influence of the referee reports on the internal referees is actually much lower. All right, so that's Discovery Grant. For RTI, it's a completely different process. And there have been changes since last year that now everybody can send again their own Discovery Grant. There is no internal, RTI Grant, there is no internal process within the university, and there is no quota anymore. However, the rest of the process is not changed, so you still have an ad hoc multidisciplinary committee. The members are renewed every year, and that depends on the pool of proposals that is sent. There are no referees, no external referee reports, and each member has to read 15 to 20 applications in full. Again, each proposal is rated on similar rating as a Discovery Grant, so excellence of researcher, merit of proposal, and then you have need and urgency, suitability of equipment, and of course importance for SQP. The evaluation process is mostly done offline. Each member basically rates all the proposals they have from 1 to 10, and they are forced to follow a flat distribution. And then all the ratings from the other 4 members are compiled, and then you basically, they receive the shared ratings. And the important point to remember for this process is, if there is a discrepancy among the 5, a large discrepancy in ratings, then suddenly your application is flagged. When they come to the deliberation process, it's a phone call, and they are only going to talk about the proposals that are flagged, whether they are highly ranked or whether they have had some good ratings or weaker rating, doesn't matter. If your proposal is not flagged, you get whatever the rating was. Then what happened after the call is each member has actually a chance to adjust either of her ratings based on the discussion, and then the final ratings are sent directly to NSERC. So it's a much more, basically, the process is a bit less in person because of that. So just to mention again a few things. So RTI evaluation really, 2 key metrics are urgency and quality of researcher. Again, the amounts are not discussed, and the members are the referees. So they are not expert in your given area, typically. So again, you need to have a proposal that's highly readable for non-experts. And that's basically all I have for those 2 processes. And I just want to let Alison talk a little bit about, so maybe I want to take this. There you go. So this is about equity and diversity, which is a new, how can we call that? New category, answer? Or?
I'm not sure if it's a new category, but it's certainly a category that's being given more emphasis than it has in the past. And so, as you will have seen in the recent federal budget, additional funds are being allocated to tri-agency organisations, and they are twinned with the expectation that Canada's research base is going to be larger and more diverse. And so the way tri-agencies are addressing that is it depends upon the actual agency. We're talking about NSERC today. And you can find out more information about NSERC's EDI, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion policies on the website here. But I thought we should talk about this with respect to how it applies to discovery. So there's kind of two parts to it. One part is as a pool of applicants and as a pool of people who are funded, NSERC wants to make sure that that pool is as diverse as possible. So in order to be able to measure that, NSERC has to be able to collect the data. And so in the past, this has sort of been a bit hazy, I think, at the tri-agency level. But what you will see when you apply is something a little like this, where information is collected about applicants. So the pictures I have is actually from the form for last year. The form for this year is improved. Rather than just asking for sex, this time gender is being asked for, and that allows people to be able to declare non-binary genders. But this is something you'll see across the tri-agencies. This is information from the NSERC guide for applicants, and in all of what we're talking about today, the information is available for you to read. It's there either in the guide for applicants or in the peer review manual. That's true with EDI, but it's true with every single part of what we're going to talk about. So NSERC does integrate EDI considerations into its policies, procedures, and indicators of excellence and evaluation. So when creating your discovery grant application package, I encourage you to think about EDI and how you're going to write about that. Some programs will ask about how applicants' sex, gender, and diversity considerations are integrated into the research design. So if your work involves human subjects, for example, I think it would be advantageous to talk about why or how you're going to incorporate EDI into how you select those subjects. And then finally, NSERC encourages applicants to explain their process of identifying, recruiting, and selecting personnel based on EDI considerations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, as we'll see further, and perhaps your questions will relate to, there are three sections in the Discovery Grant application. One of them is excellence of the researcher, one of them is merit of the proposal, and one of them is training of highly qualified personnel, HQP. Each of those three sections get equal weighting in the evaluation. So when we're thinking about preparing an application package, one way to think about it is that each section should get the same amount of time, like your time in the preparation. So in terms of EDI, excellence of the researcher can go in two different parts, and this comes directly from the peer review manual, which is what your internal reviewers and your readers will be going by in terms of applying a score, if you will, to your application. So the first part asks for the knowledge, expertise, and experience of the researcher in the natural sciences and engineering. And so examples of this are typically things like, have you been invited to give talks at conferences? Have you been invited to give talks at other universities? What kind of grants have you had in the past? And one of the sections is involvement in public outreach activities. So organising promotional events in the natural sciences and engineering, or encouraging a diverse and representative pool of emerging scientists and engineers. So this is an example of, if you have done this, if this is part of how you've established yourself as an excellent researcher, if you've done this, this is the spot to write it. This is the spot to describe that. If you haven't been doing that, that's okay. You've been doing some of the other things. So it's not something that you can just sort of create. In fact, you're writing about what you've already done. And then the next section is about quality and impact of contributions. So that's where you talk about what's being published, for example, from your group. Where's it been published? Why did you choose those particular arenas? There's a question from Ian.
I wonder, because the encouraging a diverse and representative pool of emerging scientists and engineers. Yeah, it was the point you said, the encouraging a diverse, responsive and representative pool of emerging scientists and engineers. That is outside the people who are working in your lab.
It could well be.
But
yes.
Could it include people in your lab who
Yes.
have left?
Yes, as long as
Okay.
it's within the 6-year window, so that it's
Okay.
relevant to the considerations, yes.
All right.
So what these comments do is allow us to think about, it's not just impact within our group, within our field, within our trainees, if you will. It's actually beyond that. So promotional activities in a really broad sense, encouraging people to come to the natural sciences and engineering. And in this idea, we should think about EDI as well.
It's specifically about the sciences and engineering?
Well, that's what NSERC funds. That's what NSERC funds. It funds the natural sciences and engineering.
In my specific case, I'm on the steering committee for Dow Allies, which it's changing, but it's still currently Dow Allies. And that in part attracts students to work with me, but it's not specifically about science and engineering, it's about everyone on campus, faculty, students, staff. I'm sure I'm going to write about that, but is there a way that I can make it clearer that it fits the criteria?
So I think what you've just said fits the criteria because it's inclusive of everybody, and that includes people in the
so it doesn't have to be,
natural
so it's not
sciences and
targeted, but it is still, thank you.
Yeah.
Alison, the other thing I noticed is in the HQP criteria, there's this philosophy and training plan where you could think about the future.
Yeah. And so then the final part here is importance of contributions to other researchers and end users. So we might think about that as impact. And again, there's all kinds of different ways to demonstrate impact. But one of the bullet points in the peer review manual is encouraging you to talk about the promotion and advancement of women and underrepresented groups in research, which is different from that top point, which is sort of about beyond research, about encouraging people to come to research. And so, as we heard, the other place to put this is in the training philosophy. So the training philosophy is almost a standalone piece. Some people I've seen do really quite extended jobs of this, and other people do a very small piece on their training philosophy. But our training philosophy really expands into our training examples, so the past, which is a portion of our application, and into the training plan. So in the training philosophy, NSERC is recognizing the promotion and participation of a diverse group of HQP. So taking into account equity in recruitment practices, mentorship, and initiatives aimed at ensuring an inclusive research and work environment. So in terms of the past, the record that we have is the record that we have. And that's what we have to write about. It's not like we can create something to think like that it's going to match the criteria here. We just write about what we've done. If we've done it, we write about it. If we haven't done it, we don't write about it, which is true for the other components as well. But in the plan, if this is something that's important to you, there's a place for that. And NSERC's giving consideration to EDI in a way that I think has been less apparent in the past. Mark?
How does one articulate that in their grant other than saying, I will promote the participation of a diverse group of, how does one specifically identify the practice which will lead to that?
So I think the answer to that is actually the same as for the answer to any portion of what you're trying to have people believe about your application. And it's not saying, I publish in top journals. If we're to take it outside EDI and compare it to perhaps the things that we're more familiar with, it's about saying, I publish in this journal because, and you give the reason. So it's not that you just say it, you have to demonstrate it. So within EDI, you demonstrate it. So you write more than I will. Certainly in the chemistry evaluation group, there are people who don't touch on this at all in any way. There are people who say I will, and I do, and they sort of get half marks. And there are people who really tell us how. And that might be about, for example, if you do this, write about this. You might encourage your trainees to read appropriate EDI literature. You might encourage your trainees to go to workshops that talk about EDI. You might encourage your trainees to work in an inclusive environment, to be inclusive of other people's cultures in the lab, for example. So if you do those things, write about them. If you don't do those things, don't write about them. Write about the things you do. Yeah.
Without hitting it too hard, though, that those are sort of just standard practices that the university espouses, right? This is the way we're supposed to behave as human beings. I'm talking about the recruiting practices. How do you articulate, other than say, I'm going to do this? How do you articulate, maybe I guess, how can I better do that in real life, not just grant?
So an example.
Particular thing that I should.
Yeah. So in terms of recruitment practices, for example, what recruitment practice are you following? So is there a policy that is stipulated here at Dalhousie or elsewhere within the province, within Canada, within the natural sciences and engineering, for example, that stipulates or that describes what an inclusive recruitment practice is? And if there is one that you follow, you would say that, right? So an example here at Dal is our HR department has a very well-defined protocol when we hire faculty members. So when I've written grants in the past, I've said that I follow that same protocol for when I recruit trainees. So it's a demonstration. So I don't expect you've all done that, so you won't all be writing that in your application package, but I'm sure you've done something. And then it's about writing it so that the committee can appreciate what you have done. Yeah. And some committee members care about this more than others, I would say.
If you're in an area which is currently very much dominated by women,
Yeah.
Is it reasonable to put that you're looking out for potential male candidates to join your lab?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what EDI is all about. It's about increasing the research base. So it's not about women. It's not about people of a particular culture. It's about increasing diversity. So in your field, that would absolutely be the way to do it. Yeah.
Of course, to some extent, well, to a large extent, of course, you cannot. The pool of applicants, say for a graduate studentship, is completely out of your control. You cannot say, I want you to apply. So mm-hmm. These people come, a number of people would come forward, mm-hmm. but the composition of the candidates, you have no control over. Yeah.
That can be true, yeah.
Yeah, and the same thing for, say, undergraduates that want to work in your lab, say, in biochemistry, there's the honors students. Also, you have no control over who comes forward and say, I want to work with you.
So in that case, if that's how you feel about that particular portion here, maybe it would be more appropriate for you to concentrate on the mentorship portion and initiatives aimed at ensuring an inclusive research and work environment. So given what you said, mm-hmm. that your pool is perhaps not very diverse, how do you encourage that pool to think in a diverse way, to think about diversity, and to make sure that they're working in an inclusive environment? So that perhaps in the future, the pool may be more diverse because people are seeing the group and the field as an inclusive environment.
Okay.
It's a small part of our application packages for Discovery. If you have it, if it's something you're thinking about, include it. There's a place for it. But I don't think we need to be making this stuff up, just like we shouldn't be making up anything for our application. Okay?
I guess now the floor is open for questions, and if we may, what we did last year was to try to keep questions on main topics of the application. So I think if you have, for example, a question about the common CV, I think it would be good to talk about this now, and then we can move on in within the application process. Any question about? Yeah.
I have a general question, and that is whether, with the new funding for STEM from the federal government, has anything changed in the NSERC application protocol besides the EDI component being added? But is it still the same system, bin system that they introduced like X years ago and so on? So there's just more money, but nothing more has been added. Okay.
So yes, the
Thank
answer
you.
is no.
Good.
Nothing has
Isn't that
changed.
Promo Science program new?
Yes, I know what that is.
Yeah, I think that, I haven't seen that before. But
Yeah,
it's
but
different
that's
from
not
what
new.
we-
It was there.
Okay.
Yeah. That's for outreach, more like. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Take one of those.
So, oh gosh, so there aren't any changes to the Discovery Grant program, apart from that there'll be more funds in the pool for it. But I don't think we should get, too excited about those additional funds when you spread it out over how many people are funded by NSERC. It's not going to make a massive difference to any one individual. However, there are pieces of the federal budget that may interest particular researchers outside of the Discovery Grant program. So there's going to be new types of partnership programs, for example. There will be a more diverse research base. I don't really know what that means, but I think it means other things funded that have traditionally not been included in the natural sciences and engineering. But the Discovery Grant program will stay the same.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a fairly specific question about the Common CV, and that's HQP outside your university. So, for instance, when you're putting your list of HQP that you've mentored, if you have a visiting PhD student from another university, or when you list your publication and you put some way of telling who are HQP in the authors, what about graduate students or undergraduates maybe at other universities whom you've worked with?
So I would say that visiting students certainly count and must be listed in your document. And I think that having visiting students is an excellent strategy, especially given the fact that the students at Dal cost so much, to increase the effective size of your group. So these students do count and should be listed in your document for sure. It's sort of a question. I think different people treat them differently. So I've seen cases where they've been listed as co-supervised, but then I can clearly see from the training window that they were obviously an internship student. But nevertheless, they still count, and I'm not exactly sure if anybody has any more specific advice as to how to list them precisely in terms of the drop-down menu, but they should definitely be included, and they count.
And that might be a way for you to demonstrate the value of EDI to your group. So you're bringing in somebody from a different group, maybe from a different country, maybe from a different background with a different culture. That may be a way for you to demonstrate that. And certainly what you would be doing is expanding the horizons of the people in your group through doing that, right? So then it's about talking about it rather than just listing it in the CCV. Think about that in your past contributions to training of HQP. How do you incorporate that in a very short way, but to make your point?
I just wanted, from the the date when you make the registration to the date that you submit your application, what can you change? Can you change your CV? Can you change titles? Can everything be changed? Or do some things have to stay the same?
I will answer that. You can change your CV.
Yeah.
If you have more publications, you can include them. I believe that if the title changes, that will cause confusion.
Okay.
So I would encourage not changing the title, but everything else, like the summary and the common CV, can definitely change.
So maybe what we should do is think about the process that happens at NSERC between the submission of the NIO and the full application. So the notice of intent is to enable NSERC and the evaluation group to figure out who are going to be the 5 people around the table discussing your application. That's one thing that NOI is used for. The other thing is to choose your R1 and R2, so the first and second reviewer, and then to enable R1 to figure out who they'd like to ask for the external letters or the external reviews. So think about that. What's the title and what's the text within the summary? So the way that the assignment of reviewers is done, so the 5 people around the table, is we've all had this, but we get an Excel spreadsheet with all of the titles of all of the NOIs that have come into your evaluation group, along with the details of the applicant. So the name, the institution, plus the research areas that you choose. So in the application portal, there are some drop downs, and you choose particular areas, okay? So everybody on the chemistry evaluation group will see every application that came to chemistry apart from those for which we're in conflict of interest. And so on this massive Excel spreadsheet where the writing is as small as you could possibly imagine, and there's 100 columns, in that spreadsheet, the easiest thing to see is the title. And so if I know I have an affinity with the title, I'll put, yeah, I'm able to review that particular one. I might even put, I'm really, really, really able to review this particular one, or like, no way, I don't have any expertise. So the title is really critical. It's especially critical if you think you might fall between evaluation groups, i.e. have some people around the table from the chemistry evaluation group, for example, and some from genes, cells, and molecules. It's especially important because you don't want to accidentally exclude yourself from all the chemists if you're hoping that some chemists are going to be around the table. Obviously that occurs, that applies to whichever evaluation group or groups you think you might be aiming for. If you change your focus significantly between the NOI stage and the full submission stage, the external reviewers may not be the best people to review. I think it takes a massive change to make that true, but it has happened. It's also the first time that your R1 and R2 see the application. So they'll be going in and perhaps having a look at the text when they're considering who they'd like to ask for external reviews. It's the first time they've seen it. And so, you know, I'd encourage everybody to try to make a good impression, to try to be really clear, really crystal clear, few goals, not, you know, huge background type thing. Really clear goals. What's this proposal going to be about? Therefore, am I able to review it? That's really what you're trying to get across.
Okay. Actually, I've been asked by one colleague about extenuating circumstances in your CCV. So how to actually put that in effectively. So if you have any advice to give to people that that want to highlight that that there were issues in the last 5 years that they want to bring in to the to the review panel. How do you do that? Anybody?
I'll start.
Yeah, it's a big one, but
it's tricky. I would say there's some things that you have to be very careful about. So I was department head for 5 years. I did not say that was, a bad circumstance, because it almost comes across like I'm sort of complaining I have too much work. However, if there are situations of maternity leave, that's a very legitimate reason to have a circumstance that they'll literally, if it's a year, they'll just basically look at that year and basically say, here's credit for that year. I know I've read some grants where people have had cancer treatments. To me, that's an obvious reason. But I don't think there's any one circumstance that you can say. I don't know if the other group has an opinion on this, but you do have to be somewhat careful. There's a question here.
Thank you. I just want to be clear about what the somewhat careful part is. I had one of these many years ago, and I was advised to write something like, the problem is over and this will not be affecting me going forward. Is that, obviously, mat leave, medical treatment, whatever, that was the kind of thing I had. You would say, I give me some more time because of what happened before, but is it important to make it clear that the problem or the issue or whatever is gone in terms of making your point? Because if you say, I'm up to 80 or 90% of my previous capacity, clearly you can't be you can't be expected to do as much as you were before.
It's a tricky one. I would say that, you're being evaluated based on the future. So, what's in the past. I think there was a slide up there that said no memory sort of in the evaluation process. So, so you are being evaluated on the future. I would say that probably the better strategy would be to be realistic in terms of what you're asking for. So, instead of sort of making it sound like, I want to do all of this, but I can only do part of it, maybe you are better off just sort of saying, I can do this. I don't know if anybody else has another opinion.
So I've probably read about 500 applications in my time at NSERC, and the most common unfortunate mistake people make when they're talking about delays is that they don't give a time frame. And so without a time frame, the evaluation group really cannot assess the impact. And the goal of having this section on the Common CV, but also as an opportunity to write about it in the portal part, is to give people the benefit of the doubt, which isn't an NSERC term, I should say. But to give people the benefit of the doubt that there has been some time period over the last 6 years that has affected productivity and the ability to perform in the way that one would usually perform. But without a time frame, people can't assess the impact. Is this something that's affected you for a small portion of time or for a larger portion of time? So I'd encourage you to make sure that the dates are there. If the issue is ongoing, I think Craig's point about being funded for the future is really important, because then what that gives you is two portions. One portion is about from the past until now, and you talk about that, and one portion is from the now going forward. If there's an ongoing issue, I think you just have to be truthful and say what that is and what the impact of it is. If it's an ongoing issue that you think truly affects your ability to perform and perhaps your ability to reapply, talk to NSERC about that before you apply. Because there are various mechanisms to extend current grants with or without funds. So that might be a direction to investigate.
So in practice, what happens if somebody has a delay, the simplest thing being, for example, maternity, in practice, they just take the number of years. So the interval is very critical, as you just said, because you're supposed to be evaluated on the number of years that you were active. So if you were away for 1 year, then your period is 1 year shorter than everybody else. So if you're, for example, considering the number of publications per year, then the number of years that you're being evaluated over is less. So the interval is very important. The other thing is that I've noticed that occasionally NSERC has not allowed a specific, it's not necessarily the case that you will be granted the credits for what you've described as a delay. So NSERC has the rules, I guess, and they actually tell the people during the evaluation process if the delay was valid or not. So.
Yeah, just to add to the point that was made before, if you become chair or dean or whatever, it's your personal choice, and this is not an excuse for reduced productivity.
Yeah, that would be those are the situations where I see NSERC kind of push back and say this is not criteria for shortening of the window. I'd also like to add, with respect to the maternity leaves, because of the fact that the window's adjusted for those, it's really important if, for example, the decision is made not to have the full year's leave, but you see that the going back early, for example, is impactful. I think there's information that you can give to the committee that allows them then to say, okay, well, this person was only off for 3 months, but the impact of having a child covered 8 months or whatever. And there's some dialogue I've seen in rooms over that. So I would encourage you to give as much information as possible, because the committee's not allowed to speculate. So if you tell the story, then the committee can make a rational, informed decision. And if you don't, then it's very difficult.
All right. I guess we, oh, go ahead.
So with respect to, I feel sort of odd asking this question, and I'm going to just say that up front, but I almost feel like there's going to be points attributed conceptually to diversity within a group, which is I'm fully supportive of. But to almost make clear that one has done that, which in some cases I have, you almost have to identify how you've done it. So it feels weird. It's almost like well, I have 1 of these and 2 of those and 4 of these. Is that, so how does one demonstrate it then? How do you practically, this is the part I'm having, it's like, sounds good, but how do you demonstrate I have done this? For example, especially an LGBT situation where it's come to my attention that I might, for example, have a person who falls in that category in my group, which is great. I wasn't really relevant to the science. But is there benefit to mentioning that? Are you disclosing personal information? Like, are you disclosing too much by doing that? How does one do that?
So this is all very new at NSERC, and although I've seen a lot of applications, I've not seen a lot of discussion of EDI. But like all the categories, it's not a bean counting exercise. It's a demonstration of value and impact. I don't think writing about individuals like that is appropriate, because maybe there's an assumption of somebody's gender based on in there, which is not our assumption to make. So we need to be careful about that. But I think you can demonstrate it in other ways. I think you can talk about the inclusive nature. You can talk about the activities. You can talk about the fact that people who have made their gender clear to you have come to you and been wanted and have wanted to be included in your group without stating, I have one of these, one of those, one of those. Yeah. 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 And as we heard earlier, sometimes the pool just doesn't allow for that, in which case you would focus on other areas. Yeah. And certainly what I've seen so far, anything on EDI has been a bonus. The lack of a comment of EDI has not been detrimental. But when you're thinking about HQP, when you look at the distributions of excellent, outstanding, very good, very strong, moderate and insufficient. HQP is a tough one to get excellent and outstanding on. It's a tough one. It's probably the hardest category to get excellent and outstanding on. And these are the sorts of things that are like little things that climb you that little bit more up the ladder. But just having one of these little things is not going to do it. It's kind of an all-encompassing training environment.
Further to that, it was my understanding that the grid, so there's a grid that's available to everyone, which is used, and it's, at least in my room, was used extremely carefully to move people from, let's say, the right to the left. And the language around what we're talking about, so the EDI component, I got the sense may change between what we used last year and what will be used in the year coming. And so I would encourage everyone to watch for that, because I'm applying this year, and that's something because last year the language of the grid says if the person has a statement about training philosophy and plan, then this is great. It could say next year, is the training philosophy and research plan present and well described? And so that's a game changer. So it may say if a statement on EDI is included, that's great. I mean, that's great is quite not the language NSERC uses, but you can read through the lines. Or next year it may say that a statement must be there. Now what that statement is, I'm not sure I know myself, but if that is one of the things that you're being judged upon, then you need to think carefully and make sure it's there. Because then it does become something where if you don't have a statement, then you're going to be downweighted. So pay attention, because that's all we can do at this point, particularly with respect to this criteria.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice to look at the grid. We probably see more descriptive language in the excellence of the researcher category at the moment than some of the others. And look at the differences, for example, between strong and very strong, and think about how you're going to demonstrate that you're on the left-hand side, which is the very strong side of that page. Really think about how you access convincing people that you've detailed it, you've demonstrated it, versus you've just said it.
I also have a question about the evaluation of need of your track record of in HQP. Because in my last application I had one, my HQP involved one graduate student who has been in my lab like for 4 years, and quite a number of undergrads. And the grad student had multiple travel awards, a number of scholarships. And she's first author on 2 papers and sort of co-author on another paper. However, only like one of the undergrads was included in the publication. So overall, my score in the HQP was moderate. Yeah, but how can you sort of kind of justify because it's not guaranteed that every undergrad who spends time in your lab will become a co-author. It kind of also depends, of course, on my supervision, but also on their quality. Yeah, how do you deal with that? Sort of, because the criticism was that indeed I should encourage the undergrads to be co-authors and go on conferences, but that's really not always possible.
Yeah, I would suggest here to also explain, like elaborate, not just rely on listing the people on your common CV. Use that section on HQP of the proposal to elaborate on how you contribute to your HQP becoming successful, emphasize which papers they were co-authors on, what was their contribution versus your contribution to the research and all of that. So elaborate, that's the thing that you can do, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that at least within the realm of NSERC, the idea is that the supervision of an undergraduate honors project, for example, with realistic outcomes. So does this student move on to a graduate program? Does the student move on to a career where they're using what you trained them to do? Is of equal value. So if we didn't have that rule, then if you were at a university where there was no graduate program, you would have no hope of success in HQP. So I think whether it's an undergraduate student, a master's student, a PhD student, or even a postdoc, you need to explain how these students, in whatever role they're in, have achieved the outcomes that are expected of them, and how you have facilitated or made that happen, essentially, right? So for a PhD student, is it going on to an academic career? Is it going out into industry in a role which uses the training they've received from you? And so it should be less about what level they're at and more about what they achieve within the realm of what would be reasonable for that level. Those are the metrics of success.
Yeah, and I would like to add also, track your students after they graduate or leave your lab. I almost force every one of the students who comes through me to have a LinkedIn account and keep it current. I sometimes harass alumni. Okay, I know you are in that company now. Why isn't your LinkedIn profile not updated? Please update it. And then you can go back and look at where they are and make a story out of that.
Yeah, still, it seemed to me that in the comments from NSERC, that they sort of would think that the co-authorship from undergrads was kind of a minimal expectation, that the absence of authorship of those undergrads was like an underwhelming, like a negative point. So not only, because many of those a number of those went on to medical school or to graduate studentships, but they definitely clearly in their comments was like, why have they not been co-authors? Yeah, that was clearly a minimum, an expectation from somebody who's only part-time for like a couple of months in the lab. I think that's and you don't have so many projects for every student that are guaranteed to lead to a publication. Well, maybe that's my personal failing, but I was clearly sort of called to task, say, why have these students not gone to conferences? But how many undergraduate students are you able to send on a conference? Yeah. Or how many undergraduate students are become a co-author? Sorry, I shouldn't.
I mean, I think sometimes you get comments back because maybe there isn't enough information for the reviewer to actually understand why they are there. I mean, some of the points you just talked about where these students are going, those are probably things that maybe you want to highlight. I mean, there's obviously a reason why you have undergraduate students in your lab, probably because you're using it as a recruiting tool. I'm sure you're using it as a way for your other graduate students to get experience and supervision. So these are the things that you sort of, whatever that philosophy you have as to why you have undergraduate students in your lab, you need to, again, this point of if it's not in your application, the committee won't be able to evaluate it. Like they can't read your mind, right? So you do need to be able to explain what that philosophy is, I would say.
We can't read theirs either.
No, that's true.
Yeah. The grid helps, and I didn't believe it until I was on the panel looking at that grid. And it was a really hard exercise for me because I'm so quantitative in nature, and to translate these words into a score I found very difficult. But after 3 years, I can see, I went through and, for example, I highlighted the differences between the grid as you went from right to left. And, at first you're like, well, what does superior mean compared to outstanding or whatever? But if you do that, you can see, and I would say it's humbling in the sense that when I read that grid to this day and I look at the description of a strong in all three of those categories, I think to myself, this is a successful person. This person should be funded by NSERC. And so I leave you with that, because getting to the very left of that grid is not an easy exercise in any of the criteria, let alone all three. But my strategy will be to look for, as Alison and others have highlighted, areas where I think I'm doing something above and beyond what would be considered acceptable, strong.
Johanna, is the grid the merit indicator file, the PDF thing?
It's publicly available. It's in the peer review manual. Print it off, stare at it for a while. It is humbling. At least it was for me. It may not be for everyone, but I would imagine a lot of very productive researchers in this country might be able to figure out where they are on that grid before they write their grant.
No, but I just want to know, it is the merit indicator file.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what
So
it
it's
is.
got the three criteria along the
Yeah.
far left column, and then it's got the scoring, if
Yeah.
you will. It's not scoring, it's the labeling
Yeah.
across the right, and it's public information.
Okay.
Maybe I should know this, and it's right online, and I didn't look. But for the RTI, can we only apply with one RTI? Wasn't that the case last year?
Yeah.
That's still the case?
I think that's a new. We're back to the old rule, which is basically, I think you can only be PI or co-PI on one.
That was true last year, though, was it not?
Yeah, that was also true last year. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Laurent, can I ask a procedural question?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so we don't very often have chairs from different committees all together and people who have served on those committees. So my question is this, that I've served on a committee for 4 years a while ago, and then last year I served on for 1 year the same committee. And the criteria for evaluating DAS applications changed a lot. And I just wanted to know, and some people may not know what DAS is, but it's significant. I'll let you explain that. But I'd like to hear from the different committees what the criteria are for their DAS nominations. I'm just interested because I've been told that it's the same for everybody, but I believe that it's not, and we'll see if it's true here.
So just to clarify, the DAS is the accelerator supplement. So I think.
Yeah, okay, so the criteria for the DAS awards are public information. They are for any career stage. However, they are for people who have not yet sort of established themselves on the world-class international arena. So there's a bunch of different caveats. If you're already on the international arena as a world-class researcher and you're completely changing fields, then you become eligible for a DAS. The work has to really excite the evaluation group members. And then what happens is somebody says, yes, I'd like to nominate for a DAS, and then the people around the table vote and they score, basically. And then at the end of the week, the executive committee rank the people who were nominated for a DAS. So the criteria is that you have to sort of be on the cusp of emerging to the international arena, or if you're already there, you have to be changing field. That's how it's done in chemistry.
Same.
Yeah, the statistics are very interesting because they vary across committees. So in our committee, psychology and neuroscience, more or less, I was on it for 3 years, and I can remember only one. And I think overall, the number put forward is very low. It's in the single percentages, but they vary a lot across the committees.
That's what's written in the guidelines are as they are guidelines, and what we see is a decision that has to be made by a committee, and actually the person who decides to nominate. So that the person who's maybe first reader who decides that yeah, this person should be nominated for DAS. But I've been in committees where they decide basically everybody is on the international front. You've given talks in Vienna, you've been invited somewhere to give another talk, you've published in international journals, you've attended many international meetings. And so our committee this year really had trouble with who's already at the level of international status. You've gone to Europe to be an examiner for a PhD or something like that. So in the end, that was basically so difficult to get beyond that it turned out that most of the nominees were almost early career people who really weren't international. And that's very different than a few years ago when the emphasis was more on very high-risk, innovative science. And you wouldn't give it to somebody who was extremely, internationally established. But the fact that somebody has a good rapport across the ocean shouldn't count against you. And so you can see the fine line in there. I won't take up any more time, but it's something that I'd like the chairs, if you ever get a chance to talk about DAS requirements and eligibility, it should be tweaked a little bit to make it a little bit more clear.
I would encourage you to also let NSERC know directly.
Good. I guess I have a follow-up question on that one, because is there any correlation between the ranking of your proposal and the DAS? In other words, do you need to have outstanding in some categories, or is it unrelated to, I suppose you need to have at least been funded, but beyond that, any correlation in?
No, I would think not. I mean, there's probably is a correlation, but it's not taken into consideration. And also, there are very few DAS nominations in my group as well, maybe 2 or 3. It's mostly based on whether or not the person has just made a breakthrough, they're on a serious trajectory, it's very exciting. So there is going to be a correlation to the scoring on the proposal, but it's not explicitly taken into consideration in the decision to nominate, because there are many high-quality proposals that are scored high that would not come up for DAS. Yeah.
All right.
They're just doing what they were doing very excellently. It's still excellent.
Sure,
so that would not be a DAS person. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, and I was just wondering about, you say it should be looking forward and to some extent not back more than 5 years. But if you've been around a long time and you've done stuff, say 10, 15 years a year, you're really proud of, and you think you sparked a new field or whatever, do you mention that, or does that immediately put you in the old fogey category?
You absolutely mention it, and you make an argument that it's having impact in the 6-year window that's being discussed and reviewed.
Yeah, so if you had a paper back in the 90s that continues to collect hundreds or thousands of citations in the last 6 years, you definitely make a point about that.
And where do you make that point?
Could be one of your top, whatever, 5 more significant contributions.
Oh, so
Yeah.
they don't need to be in the past 5 years?
They,
Well,
Yes,
the public,
impact in the past 5 years.
the publication is
Yeah. It's
old, but the impact is new, right?
But of course, you don't want to have 5 of those, right?
no.
But I mean, if you have one that's really major, I think you should put it there.
And you could, I've seen it, and I'm almost certain, well, I'm certain, I've seen arguments made for a collection of papers that were written some time ago that as a whole are having a significant impact in the window. So you need not just talk about one particular paper, for example. That contributions, important contribution section there's some, how should I say that, flexibility in how you present those.
A two-sided question. I'm really just stealing 2 questions, let's be honest. So the first is going to be in refereeing. So when I'm refereeing an NSERC application, I know that I've heard complaints that referees are often too sort of waffly and unclear. And so in the last couple of years, I've been pretty darn clear on some of the, and I realize my word is not sacrosanct, but some of those have gone on to be very highly funded. I'm not whinging. I'm just wondering if my directness has been used as a means of excluding that. In other words, that I must have some personal thing, which of course I didn't. The other part, which also I'm not complaining at all. I've benefited tremendously unfairly from this, and that is what NSERC doesn't do, which I think they should do, is say, what has the person done with their NSERC funding? So if I've got a ton of industry funding on unrelated projects, and I've got a big CV which I don't, let's just say, and I feel like NSERC doesn't do a good job of differentiating those 2 pieces. You almost get credit on your Discovery grant for work and effort and productivity completely unrelated. Is there any discussion of making that more, what did you do with your Discovery grant money? And I've benefited, so I'm not complaining. I want to just say that. I feel it's an unfair situation to those who say, unlike me, don't have industry funding. I feel like they're disadvantaged in that regard. So there's the referee thing. If I'm too direct, is it punitive, and the funding piece?
Okay, so can I answer to?
Yeah,
Okay, on the referee piece, the weight of the referee reports depends on many factors. One is the expertise of those 5 committee members. If there is significant expertise in on the proposal among these 5, then the external referee reports will play a smaller role. The other one is how carefully written is the is the external referee report, right? So some of them are obvious, like they simply praise the proposal without having any arguments why they praise it, so they get discounted. Others may be from people who could be too close to the applicants, and those get discounted. So it's basically varies quite a bit. On the second question, which was, okay, can you?
Like other fundings.
Other funding, yeah.
Indirectly making
Yeah, so the
better.
NSERC guest position is that Discovery grants are grants in aid. They are given to you to support your research program, and you are expected to go and seek other funds, like industry funds or MITAX funds and so on, in order to grow your group and fund your people, right? So it is not discussed like, what did you do exactly with this Discovery grant money? I mean, that's not, I haven't heard that in computer science at least.
But you could see it being unfair if someone has, for example, a really productive industry side and a fairly weak Discovery grant side. They're going to come. It doesn't matter. So okay, and I benefited from this. So maybe we don't need to get any further than I.
As long as it doesn't hurt the quality of the science you're producing, it has no impact.
Yes, I'm just talking about people who do much more basic science and don't have the ability to stretch into those areas. It hurts them.
It does. Yes.
The only caveat would be for people who are in areas which may be health related or social science related. And if you're in those areas, be very careful and make sure you seek guidance from people who know how to write around that.
Sorry. I mean, there is one of the headings of your proposal. The very first one is recent progress. I tend to highlight what I have done with my past Discovery grant, but I'm also trying to leverage all the other things as well. But certainly, if you're just if you don't have that industry involvement, then that is the place to highlight how well you've used your last Discovery grant.
And just with regard to the referee reports, the ones another subset of reports that I've seen downvalued or almost ignored are ones that are unnecessarily negative. And often, if that happens, the candidate's also made aware that there was one that was deemed to be of that nature and discounted by the group. The other thing that I've seen happen is, and so a referee may get their hands on the grid or not, but effectively one doesn't know, and actually scores the candidate on the 3 criteria, and that can't be used because that person, even if it's somebody who's served on the committee, isn't calibrated with the group. And so going forward, when asked to write a referee report, will probably actively avoid the language of the grid because it's not useful, because you're not calibrated. So saying this person is strong is not a good idea. So that would be the...
I want to be very clear. I don't mean inappropriately negative action.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there was the one who, in his HQP section, said, so-and-so and so-and-so graduated recently. I'm sure there's many more, but I can't bother to look. I swear that was in, and I said, how can one be, and this person got a very big grant in chemistry. Period. So it makes one, as a referee, kind of think, why am I spending all my time doing this when that's, but I guess it's just part of it.
Yeah, one of the points that I made on my exit interview, let's say, was this whole idea of this sort of halo effect where you see people who have been very successful with NSERC for many, many years not take the time to fill out the CCV properly. And my view on that is everybody should do it completely. And in a situation where we have high success rates in Canada compared to other countries, for example, if we're looking for ways to lower that success rate, then those would be no-brainers for me. Now, I'm not saying that happens, but that's to your point. I mean, you need to say things that have information in them, or not say them at all.
So I don't think it's a problem to write a negative letter as long as it's thoughtful. I mean, I think that's what your point was too. I mean, if you have a negative opinion that's supported by thoughtful ideas, then write a negative letter. Sometimes the people on the committee will override you because they have enough expertise that they feel like they disagree with you, and so that just can happen. But a letter is not thrown out just because it's negative. It's thrown out because it's overly negative, which is what she said. I just wanted to make that clear, that means that the people on the committee did not feel as negatively as the guy that wrote the letter, and so they take that into consideration.
And a lot of those were negative comments with no because.
Yeah, with no because,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
So.
Make a comment. I'd just like to give some words of advice based on 3 years on the committee and 3 years on the committee 25 years ago. And the world has changed a lot. And the most recent change is the reliance placed on HQPs and the writing of that. It's a rather new skill. And even over the 3 years most recently, I've seen the evolution of a very sophisticated ability to fill that part out. And if you have the ability to seek other members of your department to read through that section, I urge you to do that. In our department, which is large, we have an arrangement where people who have been successful in NSERC grants have it on file for anybody who's writing one to look at it. So they know how this particular person was evaluated, so they know this HQP section was rated good or moderate or whatever, so they can calibrate against that. But people with equivalent records can write very different HQPs. And I've seen that overall the binning is being sort of, how should I say, telescoped into one bin, and usually because the HQP section has been lower than the others, so everybody ends up in the same bin and they all end up with $22,000. So the amount of money is not being spread out as much as it used to be, because everybody is, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are not actually putting their best foot forward with respect to the HQP section. And this also interacts with the stature, or not the stature of the school, the nature of the school, whether you have access to graduate students. So somebody at Mount Allison, for example, they don't have big graduate programs, and so they have less access to graduate students, so they have good access to undergraduate students, but somehow or other we're meant to evaluate them all the same, even if they're from, McGill or something like that, which have great access to graduate students. So the more input you can get from your peers to the writing of that section, the better.
Is that something you could do, is to solicit the outstanding, who've actually got outstanding marks on their HQP at Dalhousie and make it available for us to see at the university?
Typically, we don't know. So in other words, we could make a request.
Self-identify.
Yeah, exactly.
Perhaps.
I mean, we don't know who got what. These are,
It would be very, very helpful.
these are private information you receive, and the administration is not privy to that information.
Yes,
To
a note could go out to those who were successful to.
Yes, we could do
If you
that.
would be willing to do that, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah, what we do in computer science is to have an internal peer review system where people submit drafts by, say, July or early August, and they get reviewed by other faculty and they receive comments. We also have a bank, I guess, of past successful proposals for people to look at, and those are made available on a volunteer basis.
Yeah.
So we could conceivably ask people to give us their scores and include them with the proposals, but again, it's up to the individual whether they want to do that or not. Yeah.
It would be, yes, that's true. Another thing, within the Faculty of Science, we encourage every department to basically, and basically everyone who is applying to go to their peers and at least have one or two person reviewing your proposal. And we have a large faculty, so there's such a broad expertise that it's really within each department that works the best, or with collaborators.
The best thing to do is get one peer reviewer who is close to the area and another one who is not.
Yeah.
So you get feedback from these two different perspectives.
But for smaller departments, it would be useful to have that wider network.
Sure, that's a good idea.
If you were first, go ahead. Oh, you have that in your hand. Go on.
Yes, thanks. I was actually even earlier. Getting back to just before this last question, to things that have impact from more than 6 years ago. Citations were mentioned, but what about other things? For instance, I worked on color standards for the World Wide Web for accessibility. And I made sure that, and I tried to work with W3C on them and Bobby, which was at the time the very big organization. I never got credit for it, but the things that I did that I paid students to do the research for show up now in guidelines that are used internationally. So I usually claim these, although there's not much more impact in the last 6 years than there was in the previous few years. Is that still appropriate? Is that something the committee would just go, oh, whatever? And other things, I used to work on electronic publication, which isn't publishing journal articles in electronic form, which isn't done in the same way that I started doing it. But it was very important at the time, and it affected my particular research community a lot. Is that something I should still be talking about, or am I wasting my space?
Well, I would say that a list of citations from the last 6 years is very concrete and directly attributable to your work. general culture that prevails in a community that cannot be directly attributed to your own work, that's probably a bit less, I guess, it's more tenuous, I guess. So it all depends on how you said it. Like if you made a concrete contribution to standards and you can back it up, and this contribution is still in the standard and in wide use, then that's probably okay to include, but we have to put it in the proper context and be truthful about it.
Yeah, and I would say that if you have end users that are, implementing your work in guidelines and like sort of like I had, you should definitely highlight that, even if it was 10 years ago, because that's real impact actually.
I wanted to, where did she go? Left. I wanted to talk about HQP. So last time I applied, I was applying along there was another colleague of mine on the same cycle, and I was, my HQP was really, really good, but I was much younger. And he had served on NSERC before, and his HQP was also very good, and he got, but not so much better than mine if you just counted, but he got marked higher. He went in a better bin. So I was asking him why, and the answer was it's also impact over a length of time, a period of time. So if you're in your first few rounds, and even if you have a very diverse lab or group, it still does not put you necessarily in the 6 bin or 5 bin. At least that's the way it was explained to me. Could you please speak to that?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I don't know if I would agree with that, to be honest. I think again, it's sort of the point that was raised before about, the committee can only evaluate your HQP based on what you have written, and that relates to your plan and your past involvement. You need to do your best to try to accentuate those 2 points. So, it's not just about counting people. So even though you guys may have had, the same number of HQP, perhaps because he was on the committee, he was able to communicate, that past and the future better. But that's just my opinion.
One extreme case is where we get applicants in computer science from engineering, where you've got the senior year project.
Yes.
So you have like 2 pages of undergraduate students coming on an application, and we know that, they haven't published with them. It is simply a long list of students because they happen to supervise a lot of those senior year projects. So that immediately gets discounted. So it is not just the number of HQP, but also how you present it. Like, have you published with this HQP? Do you have papers with those HQP as co-authors that you can state and elaborate?
But I did, and I had written 2 pages about that, and I had it evaluated and read, and yet we were in 2 different bins.
Well, you could end up in a different bin for reasons other than your HQP, because they're
No,
to get
just
to a
on
bin.
the HQP, just on the HQP. So
you had 2 different scores.
we got 2 different scores. Yeah, on that. But that can be. Anyway, I wanted to know if that is true, because I don't believe there is complete lack of bias in the committees. There can't be. So, yeah. Thank you.
Believe it or not, only 2 minutes left in principle. Any burning question, anything about, for example, the research proposal? Because we didn't really touch about that at all.
So just wondering about how say, the review committees also, because I'm and then in my case it would be the cells molecules review panel. How that review panel think about, say, a proposal which basically proposes to follow up on a serendipitous discovery, whereby you have noticed an effect on say something to do with a major cell biological process. And you say, well, we can learn from this phenomenon that I have observed, and that's how I would see it. But maybe I see that in a much more positive light than others, than reviewers. So comments I got back was that actually the agents that I saw having an interesting effect, they said, well, this is not so biologically relevant. Because it doesn't occur it's a kind of a special condition, but I would think that specifically you can use that to discover general principles, but clearly the committee didn't look at it in that way. But how would committees think in general about following up on serendipitous discoveries? Is that okay or better not?
So my first piece of advice would be to get some help from somebody in the field. So if you're applying to 1501, find out who's served on 1501 and ask them to read your proposal and see what their thoughts are. So that would be my first piece of advice. In terms of the serendipity, I think proposals should include things like that. If that's where you're basing your plans, that's fine. But the devil's in the detail of what it is you're trying to investigate, why you're trying to investigate it, how you're going to investigate it, how you compare it to what's already in the literature, so what's the background, what are the impacts if you're successful with the research. Those kinds of things are what makes the evaluation group able to give you a high score. It's not just the idea and where it came from. So I really encourage you to get advice from somebody from 1501 on that, especially given the area. You need to make sure that you're obviously not transgressing into health research, to making it very clear that you're talking about a program, not a project. If it's just one little idea, really, no matter where it comes from, if it's a project, NSERC doesn't fund projects through Discovery grants. They fund programs. In terms of a proposal in general, the best proposals I've seen have been in sort of 3 or 4 sections. 3, I think, is a good number to aim for. The first one might sort of talk about projects you've got on the go, projects that you've kind of started and you've had some success so far, and this is how you're going to conclude them, and this is what the impact. A portion on new ideas, new but fairly grounded ideas, and then a portion that's kind of out there. They're the best proposals that I've seen. But the out there piece needs to be feasible. Needs to be feasible by your group in your environment. So if I were to propose I'm going to invent, some kind of rocket to go into outer space, that might be out there, but it's not feasible with the expertise that I have.
I guess there's no question. I'd like to thank the panel again for spending the time, and hope to see you again next year.